I'm not really sure how I've made as many videos as I have without one of them being about the Lord of the Rings. Heck, I'm not even sure I've so much as really mentioned it. I mean, let's be honest. There really isn't much I can say about it that you don't already know. Tolkien's series is one of the most enduring of all time, it's maintained its status as the gold standard within the fantasy genre for over 70 years, and resulted in the creation of one of the most well-received and successful film adaptations of a book of all time. Of course, like any other book that finds success, it's been adapted into a million other mediums as well, including radio and stage plays, television, and most importantly for this show, video games. And there has been no shortage of Lord of the Rings video game titles released over the years, believe me. Newer games such as Shadows of Mordor and an aptly titled MMORPG by the name of Lord of the Rings Online are some of the best known, but the Lord of the Rings game that I have the most connection to is that of the Third Age, released in 2004 and developed by a division of EA Games known as Redwood Shores. Most of all, I remember playing this game with my father as a child, and considering I probably wasn't even 10 when we played, I imagine I was probably the worst teammate of all time. I had actually completely forgotten about the game until very recently when both my father and a viewer commenting on my Demonstone video reminded me of it at eerily similar times. And I bit. Look, like pretty much every human being currently trapped on Earth, I am a sucker for nostalgia, and I wanted to see if it was as much fun as I remembered it being. I mean, come on. It's an RPG set in the world of the Lord of the Rings. In what way could it sincerely be bad? The answer to that question is, in a lot of ways. My goodness, where do we begin? The Third Age is a tried and true tale of trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole. First, some context, mainly so that a lot of the shortcomings that I'm about to discuss make sense. At the time that they developed this game, EA only had the rights to produce works based on the New Line Cinema film adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. The rights to the literary material were held by Vivendi Games, and they used those rights to release titles such as The Fellowship of the Ring. In deference to that agreement, EA could basically only make games based around aspects that were mentioned in or unique to the films and their presentations. That means they couldn't actually adapt the story of The Fellowship, because the story of The Fellowship, as I'm sure you understand, uniquely originated in the literary material. So, when EA, after publishing a few games that effectively just made scenes from the movies playable, decided that they wanted to create a proper RPG with their license while being unable to adapt the story everyone knows and loves, they did the next best thing. They created a shadow narrative which follows ridiculously closely to the story of The Fellowship and proceeded to just play a bunch of clips from the movies to tell the story of the Fellowship anyway. The game sees the player take on the role of Barethor, who's on his way to Gondor when he gets ganked by a pack of Nazguls and promptly gets his mixed like he's playing an online fighting game on late 90s dial-up. Luckily for him, a kind plot device, Elven Woman, appears to drive the monsters away, healing his wounds and beckoning him to aid her on a quest of the utmost importance. What is that quest? Doesn't matter, because it's about 0.3 seconds after the introductory cutscene that the game starts throwing scenes from the movie at you. Actually, you're shown scenes from the movies before the introductory cutscenes, so that kind of just disproves that point now that I think about it. The entire story of this game, if it can be called that, is based around the premise that Gandalf has some sort of connection to Barethor, frequently speaking to him of all the events that everyone knows about. Outside of those nice therapy sessions with everyone's favorite wizard, Barethor and company run from area to area, fighting an ungodly amount of enemies, and always managing to stay a near-perfect, legally mandated arm's length from the Fellowship. And yes, it is very difficult talking about all of this without actually showing any of these movie clips, but I am far too scared of Sony sending me to the Shadow Realm to take that risk. I would not do well in Florida. I've talked about games with lacking stories before, and I believe I can be pretty forgiving, especially when it's warranted. But this is as shameless as it gets. Normally, it's at least somewhat difficult for me to write scripts while tap dancing around the fact that I try to keep these videos spoiler-free. That's not the case here, because if you know the story of the Fellowship, you know the story of this game. Most of what it does in relation to that story just doesn't make any sense. They blatantly favored fan service over any sort of sincere narrative. Of course, not a lick of this is canon. You show up to fight the Balrog at one point. Yeah, Gandalf was the only one strong enough to face the demon, so long as he had the store-brand Fellowship to help him out. Come on, man. It feels like it would have been difficult to put less effort into this. It doesn't even matter that you're playing as 6 new characters. All of them, in some way, are just stand-ins for the characters we know and love. Barethor is Boromir, Elagast is an amalgamation of Aragorn and Legolas, Hadhod is Gimli, I'm pretty sure Idril is supposed to be Arwen, it doesn't matter who Eowyn is because he shows up last and has zero bearing on anything, and no one cares about Morwen. None of them are ever fleshed out. The game tries to introduce some subplots showing that Elagast and Hadhod are buddies, or the horrendous, almost laughable love triangle between Barethor, Idril, and Morwen, but it's all just dropped as quickly as it shows up, so I'm not even sure why they bothered. There are some side quests that are supposed to, grant some backstory to these cardboard cutouts and tie them into the world, but a lot of them are just grinding enemies or picking up an item, and all of them are along the path of the main story, so they're basically impossible to miss. They just act as experience dumps for whoever your overworld character is. Now, I know what you might be thinking.
Fandrax, in your last video you said that not playing the hero, or even the protagonist of the story at hand, in Shadowdale was cool. What gives?
Yeah, I'm fine with not playing the hero. I'm not fine with doing absolutely nothing of consequence and having nothing to get even vaguely invested in for the better part of 20 hours. You would hope, with no real story present, that the world, considering how detailed and huge Middle-earth is, would be fun to explore. But there's no exploring to actually be done. The game is almost entirely linear. The areas themselves are barren and empty, meaning that you're not actually exploring them because there's anything of interest, but simply because you have to open the numerous chests that are conveniently placed all around. Normally, the items in overworld chests contain nothing more than extra goodies and whatnot, but not in the Third Age. More often than not, you'll be finding equipment upgrades, check-the-box quest items, and usable items that, while you might not need, you'll definitely want. This is because outside of a small time where you get to run around Helm's Deep, there is no tangible world in this game. There's hardly any NPCs for you to talk to, nor is there any sort of currency or shop system. The entirety of Middle-earth's supply and demand is apparently dictated by an assortment of chests left lying around by an unseen sociopath, the price of opening them usually another combat encounter. In light of that, combat is really all this game has left, and thankfully, the combat is pretty fun. But you want to know why the combat's fun? Because it's literally copied from Final Fantasy X. With the ability to swap characters in and out of combat, the persistent turn order scroll on the right, and the ability to skill characters however the player sees fit, this is basically Final Fantasy X in Lord of the Rings. The use of what FF10 dubbed the conditional turn-based battle system is a boon in the sense that it is a battle-tested, polished framework with which to enjoy combat within. But by the same token, it struggles in the sense that what is on display in the Third Age is nowhere near deep enough to generate the same impact. For the basics, it's everything you expect. Characters cast skills from ability points, the perfect mode meter is built through taking combat actions, and turn order is based around the speed of both characters and the skills they're using. Whereas FF10 had the intricately designed sphere grid, the Third Age just has some basic skill trees and passive abilities. To make up for that absence, the Third Age instead has abilities skilled through the usage of other abilities in the same tree. This is a neat idea in theory, but god, it is pretty abysmal in its implementation. Every ability, no matter its AP cost, damage, or purpose, grants you all of one skill point. That means as the thresholds gradually soar higher, with late game abilities requiring 100 skill points to unlock, you just start grinding. To make matters worse, the developers were acutely aware of this reality. Every single character starts with an ability, being low in AP cost and mimicking a basic attack, that is there for no other reason than to be grinded with. Honestly, the only reason to ever use a simple attack is if the weapon has some sort of special effect attached to it, or if your character is fast enough that it will allow them to act twice in a row. Every single combat turns into an exercise in figuring out how to use as many abilities as possible. And unfortunately, unless you plan on running yourself in circles to generate encounters to grind off of, which, if you can stomach any more of this game's combat with how much it throws at you to begin with, God bless you, there really is no way to unlock everything. Each character has 2 ability trees, and whether you like it or not, with how useful and borderline necessary some of the endgame abilities are, you're going to be forced into gearing more towards one than the other. For as much as 2 trees, as well as a few items that unlock crafting skills, let you choose how to skill your character, the fact of the matter is that due to the way the characters work together, the choice is basically made for you. For instance, Idriel is the only character with any real healing ability, and the only one who can revive through skills, so investing in her sword tree, when characters such as Berethor and Hadhad both have much stronger melee options, is pointless. In the same way, I never found much use for Hadhad's ranged spirit abilities due to the presence of Elagost's archery and Idriel and Eodin's magic. None of this is balanced. There are some earnestly game-breaking synergies, such as the fact that Berethor's strength-increasing aura works with his other auras, juicing those already powerful skills into overdrive. Elagost learns a passive ability that makes his Arrows of Sleep skill hit all enemies, which is a complete necessity for running through mooks in a timely fashion. Remember when I said no one cares about Morwen? Yeah, it's because she might be one of, if not the worst character I've ever played as in an RPG. She's supposed to be the gadget character, being able to steal from enemies, but the whole point of gadget characters is that they bend the rules and interact more effectively with the world around them. Well, all of the other characters break the rules just fine on their own, and there is no world to interact with, so you just get left with a horrible fighter who literally dies in one turn if hit with the right ability. You almost get the sense that the developers realized that a lot of this stuff was a little out of whack, but just left it in, because why not? There is some fun drawn from messing around with the busted stuff, but the charm wanes quickly. I think balance in RPGs is a lot more important than typically realized, because when it isn't present, you get left with an experience that is fun at face value, but devoid of thought or innovation, and unfortunately, the Third Age is probably a perfect example of that. Even the inclusion of an evil mode where you get to play as enemies and take out your frustrations toward this game on the party doesn't offer much. In most cases, these combat instances are insanely easy, and the items earned from completing them aren't even that good, so it feels kinda pointless in the grand scheme of things. I'm not so jaded that I can admit that it is pretty cool when the actual heroes of this story show up and fight alongside you later in the game. But by that time, the combat turns into such a slog, and you've done so much of it to that point, that it becomes a chore to get through. And it's only made worse by the fact that a bunch of endgame enemies are just turned into damage sponges for the purpose of drawing things out even further. Look at this fight with Faramir. This orc captain just has a completely unnecessary amount of health, to the point that Faramir barely does any real damage to him. I've sped this clip up by whatever amount is on the screen just to make it fit in this section. And I died. So clearly time well spent. This is a very noticeable problem with the game as a whole. There was clearly more attention paid and effort put into the areas in the beginning of the game as opposed to the end. Eventually, the game just basically stops giving you an overworld to run around it. It'll show you a few movie scenes, throw you into combat, and then rinse and repeat until the playtime has been sufficiently padded. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the game starts to look like a goddamn tech demo towards the end. And whatever the hell is going on here starts to happen with a lot more frequency. Great AI on display, guys. I think the saddest part about all of this is that there is some quality here. The combat animations are really well done. Both Ian McKellen and Christopher Lee reprised their roles with a surprisingly strong supporting cast, and I thought the music, though there isn't a ton of it, really fit the Lord of the Rings motif well. Obviously, the game didn't look as good as it does here when it was first released. This was upscaled through emulation, but there were certainly worse looking games released at the time. Speaking of emulation, which is kind of important if for some reason you want to play this game because it isn't available anywhere officially, there has been a long-standing bug with PS2 emulation that results in strange gray bars laying over the screen at random times, best seen here in this photo from the PCSX2 wiki. It has kind of flabbergasted people over the years, especially in the way that nothing seems to fix it. For as much as people haven't been able to figure out what they are, I'm pretty sure they're shadows that get screwed up through hardware emulation in relation to the angle of the camera. Now, I don't proclaim to have fixed anything, but after some fiddling, I never had the bars show up, and those weird overlays only appeared briefly in select cutscenes and when I went looking for them. I will leave more details about all of that in the description. Other than cashing in on their license and the popularity of other turn-based RPGs, I can't really understand what the real purpose behind making this game was. It's so lacking in everything that makes series like Final Fantasy great. Trying to make a traditional RPG with such a lacking story and premise just feels like a recipe for failure, and I would be hard-pressed to believe that those that actually worked on this game didn't feel the same. Tactical turn-based combat really isn't suited towards being the only selling point of an RPG. No matter what, it tends to get a bit boring over the length of a game, which forces the story and characters to step in to keep players engaged. And it's a shame because outside of the aforementioned MMO, there really hasn't been a great Lord of the Rings based RPG released to date, and the Third Age certainly isn't going to change anyone's opinion about that. More than anything, playing through this game again made me realize that I was pretty lucky as a kid. Most of the games I've revisited, many on this channel, hold up and are still pretty fun years later. But that just isn't the case with the Third Age. There just simply isn't enough content, and what the game predicates itself upon has been done so much better in other titles. With how hard it is to play today unless you've got a disc lying around, I can only recommend this one to really die-hard fans of The Lord of the Rings. And quite frankly, if you are that into Tolkien's works, then a lot of what this game does will probably frustrate more than amuse.